The Walking Dead holds a pretty exclusive spot alongside Game of Thrones in the "we were at the top of the world to define all of television, but somehow burned it all down" club. But even so, year after year, a single clip from the pilot is all it takes for me to be locked in all over again. So I got to wondering, what exactly is it that makes it the timeless masterpiece of a premiere that it is? Is it the nostalgic shot-on-film look? Is it the legendary OST by Bear McCreary? Or is there something more? Well, I'd say it's all of those things, and plenty more. So today, join me for a far too long look back at the premiere that redefined the zombie genre and Halloween nights all around the world. The episode begins with a cold open. It's quiet. Eerily quiet. Just a single car driving down on an empty street. A turned-off traffic light in the far side of the shot already subtly tells us that something is wrong. But as soon as the car nears, the camera slowly pans out to reveal a flipped upside-down car. And then another. With a single shot and not a single word spoken, we know that we have been thrown right into the deep end and the world has been turned upside down. And then there's that intense juxtaposition with Rick. He's this completely clean police officer, not even a stubble forming on his face. But the world around him is not just dying, but already completely broken. It's this intense contrast between order and chaos. With many of the greatest premieres in television, it's these first shots that set the tone for absolutely everything to follow. Whether it's going beyond the wall, or Walter fleeing through the desert, or the Colossal peeking over the wall, it sets those first impressions that will now become the baseline for the rest of the story. And so with Rick here, I think it immediately establishes the eerie side of the apocalypse. One where the horror doesn't come from like sprinting zombies, but rather the remnants of humanity itself. With his face in this perpetual state of confusion and unease, he walks into the campsite. We catch a few glimpses of dolls, food canisters, strollers, and right next to them, a decomposing body swarmed by flies. And then there's that sign of no gas. It's kind of like this one last, "the world is dead, we cannot help you, it's all gone" type of saying. And I think this is as good of a place as any to talk about Darabont's direction style, because I think this cold open is a pretty explicit example of that. What you'll notice with many of the Season 1 episodes is how much the environment and the world itself will do the heavy lifting. Dialogue might be used pretty sparingly, and not in the "I will now spoon-feed you" lore fashion either. I guess I'd sort of explain it as creating an experience rather than just a show. And I think a series like The Walking Dead captures that incredibly well. Some lines of dialogue, or even lack thereof, might seem clunky and sort of unrefined when looked at in isolation. But when you zoom out and look at it as a holistic experience, it's all a part of building a consistent vision for this world. Later in the series, when showrunners changed, people even coined the term of Gimple speak. It was essentially describing the fact that some characters talked like philosophers rather than just real people.
I lose people, and then I lose myself.
Love doesn't die. Watch.
It was the show effectively using the characters as just mouthpieces for specific lines of dialogue or specific ideas, as opposed to building dialogue and interactions based around a living, breathing character and their existence in the larger world. Later seasons of The Walking Dead seemingly had so many different characters, but all of them were actually telling their own isolated stories. Really, there was very little coexistence between them and sort of interactions between them. The Season 1 story, on the other hand, all of it is in some way connected and all of them bounce off of each other. But okay, I admit that's a bit of a tangent that's not really important right now. With a scene like this, it will be slow, it will be drawn out, and there won't be any dialogue whatsoever until it makes sense. But in the same episode, you will also see short, simple lines that add absolutely nothing to the plot, but work to convey the humanity at the core of this story. It's all about creating a sense of presence for us, the viewers, in this world. You cannot tell a story with real grit if you file away the imperfections. It's those imperfections that make it what it is. And nowhere is that best showcased than the following scenes. Rick turns to leave, but notices scuffling behind him. We see this small hand reach down to pick up a teddy bear, obviously making Rick think that a lone kid is wandering around this nightmare of a campsite. The first lines we hear in this episode is of a police officer calling out to help a little girl, literally holding onto a teddy bear. It's like the pure sign of innocence and weakness, and Rick is there trying to offer help. But as she turns around, there's this slow zoom-in shot on her zombified face. Her glassy eyes now fixated on Rick. And a short moment later... First and foremost, this is like the most concentrated, most raw, most in-your-face way to tell you that this series, it won't be pulling any punches, and this is just the beginning. Is this total loss of innocence, a total shattering of expectations? In the first 4 minutes of a show, a police officer just shoots this little girl. Even in The Walking Dead itself, there are very few instances of zombified kids or kids just straight up perishing because, well, it's kinda messed up. But that is exactly what the scene is here to achieve. It makes you question just how far the series will go if this is what it opens up with. Unfortunately, this was still AMC, so they were definitely reeled back in with some of the upcoming comic material. But in terms of opening the series with a bang, well, this definitely achieves that. And the thing that I think illustrates that particularly well is Darabont's addition of smart, walkers a la Romero zombies. For those unaware, in the original comic, as well as a majority of the TV show, that is until they randomly retconned them back in, all walkers were just plain and dumb. There were a few minor differences, like some sat around while others walked, but in the comic, there was absolutely zero sign of intelligence for the simple reason of it just not being the focus of the story. Differentiating them in any way automatically makes the story shift so that people think about the different kinds of infected, how they would react, yada yada. That's just not what The Walking Dead is about, and Kirkman never wanted you to think about that. Throughout the first season of the show, on the other hand, there are a number of special walkers of sorts to facilitate further conflicts. But very, very importantly, they are never the primary driver of said conflict, but more so just tools to put an even greater focus on what was already there. With the whole picking up teddy bear thing, for example, her intelligence and the teddy bear itself obviously means absolutely nothing. All it does is elevate the tension that was already there. Ditto for Morgan's wife turning the doorknob. It is never a plot device for her to, get inside of the house or anything like that. It is just there to elevate the already existing conflict within Morgan. Even the rock-carrying walker later in Atlanta isn't a one-all-be-all event. It's just this more visual showcase that they are swarmed and the time is running out. With or without the rock, the glass would inevitably give out. That's what it means to truly understand the material you're adapting. Smart walkers are a huge, huge change from the source material, but Darabont never used them as a sort of a new part of the story. No, he just used them as this magnifying glass to even further accentuate Kirkman's core story that was already there. It's simply another thing in his tool belt to add grit to the already very, very messy zombie story. When you take all of the smart walkers and look at them in isolation, they don't change a single thing about the plot. The only thing they do is add depth to the human story that we are addressing at that time. Also, because I know someone's already left a comment about that, real quick obligatory checklist of headcanons that have persevered for way too long and people keep parroting them. No, the smart walkers don't exist because their brains are decaying. We would have seen fresh people turning exhibit similar traits, but we never do. And no, it's also not the virus mutating because, well, they're retconned back in and sort of treated as a thing that's supposedly always been around, even though it wasn't. It was a plot hole that they retconned out and then retconned back in, and essentially is just bad writing. The one and only reason why they're exclusive to Season 1 is because Darabont was the showrunner for exclusively Season 1. After the now legendary Bear McCreary intro, we open with another shot to immediately create an intense juxtaposition of what we just saw. The first shot we get is a close-up of a half-eaten burger and fries, clearly implying that this is not the undead world we just saw. They don't need to finish it because food is aplenty. As for Rick and Shane, this conversation establishes so much of their dynamic that it's kinda nuts. Looking back, it's kind of eerie how much you can already feel that tension brewing even though there is zero tension and no conflict whatsoever. Some of that is a bit more subtle, with things like him dipping fries into Rick's ketchup, which is 1, gross, and 2, shows that Shane is totally fine with pushing some of those more personal boundaries. In this case, it's just him being gross with food, but very, very soon, we'd also see how that extends to even Rick's wife, which, is a whole lot more gross. Ditto for Rick asking,
"What's the difference between men and women?"
Shane starts rambling about how women are bad at turning off lights, yada yada, but what's important is that follow-up where Shane asks how Lori is doing. Rick says that she's doing great and that he is actually the one who forgets to turn off the lights. First off, considering most of the sequence was Shane rambling based on just a single question from Rick, it immediately shows us that Rick is a lot more subdued and closed off. He even says that Laurie always complained that he rarely talks and doesn't really say what he's feeling or thinking, as opposed to Shane, who just rambled on about like anything and everything. But even more importantly, Rick saying that he's the one who forgets to turn off the lights, and then saying that when he does open up to Laurie, she acts like she never actually wanted to hear it, begins to explore that question of masculinity we'd see between Rick and Shane. Based on the whole light conversation, and Rick saying that he's the one who forgets about it, it's implying that he is more feminine, right? A lot of media depicts these Giga Chad characters as the strong silent types, which, you know, is not exactly healthy. But the paradoxical thing that we explore here is how, in spite of what people claim, showing vulnerability can often backfire, making Rick hide his true thoughts even further.
Last thing she said this morning, sometimes I wonder if you even care about us at all.
With Shane, on the other hand, we see him internalize that pain and doubt to such an extreme degree that he just essentially explodes with rage. In the dead world that they'll soon find themselves in, he tells himself that the extreme measures are not just necessary, but they are what make them strong.
I'm a better father than you, Rick, because I'm a better man than you, Rick, because I can be here and I'll fight for it.
So yes, there is definitely a very strong bromance going on here, but with every single line, and this is obviously only recontextualized with the benefit of hindsight, we see those cracks between them that would soon become full-blown caverns. As soon as you see the whole love triangle form, each and every one of these scenes become extremely clear foreshadowing to their entire conflict, in which the roles of this strong protector are the primary pillar. Are you a man if you forget to turn off the lights? Are you a man for talking about your thoughts and feelings? All of these questions are ones we'd explore plenty with Season 2. This entire prelude to the actual apocalypse starting is why I did, or am at least tempted to, name this video Improving on Perfection. None of these scenes are from the source material, all of this is entirely TV exclusive. But just like the cold open established the tone for the rest of the series, this single conversation establishes not just Rick's inner conflict about the type of father he is, but also the primary conflict that would define basically the entire first major block of Rick's story, stretching all the way through to, again, the end of Season 2. In the book, much of this was quite sudden, and the Rick vs. Shane stuff was wrapped up even before they left the Atlanta camp. I think the show made a really smart decision in letting all of that brew for quite a bit longer. The first ever scenes we see of them already introduced the core of what their story would be about. Their personalities never really changed. They simply would manifest in very different forms before and after the apocalypse.
Last thing she said this morning, sometimes I wonder if you even care about us at all.
I'm doing stuff, Laurie. Thanks.
We're awful grateful for what you did.
We then move into the entire robbery debacle. As they're driving, we get the shot of a cat and a couple of crows that will likely get me demonetized, but it's just this bad omen for the story that we're about to see. Crows, in both this story as well as like literally every single piece of media, like seriously ever, are used as an omen for death. Something we'd be seeing plenty in just a few minutes. And even more than that, in a story like The Walking Dead, I think you could also look at it as an omen for disease. As in, the crows are feeding on this dead cat and spreading any number of diseases. Just like we'd see later in this same episode with them feeding on the walkers. Which, by the way, is also why I think the prison sickness arc is one of the greatest arcs in the entire television series, which again wasn't in the comics, and I think we should have seen a lot more of that. In the Walking Dead universe, the origin of the virus has never really been explored outside of Kirkman's seemingly half-joking space spore comment, which more so seems to be in reference to Romero's zombies. So, much like we've talked about already, I don't think the shot of the crows is really in any way important to the plot, but it's again just Darabont's vibe-based storytelling. It's both just a gross scene that preps you for what's to come, as well as just this looming omen of plague, death, disease, and all of those kinds of things. 10 out of 10, no notes. Also, definitely overanalyzing here, but giving Rick the revolver fits his character so incredibly well. Realistically, they probably just wanted to make him a bit of a sheriff caricature, so of course it's a revolver. But from a character sense, just like Rick is quiet and reserved, the revolver is extremely limited in its capacity. Every decision and every shot is calculated, and it is incredibly important. And it also just looks hella cinematic, so of course it's cool. Once they're setting up their little defense line, we also get a bunch more characterization around Shane and Rick. The others are goofing around about getting on one of those cop shows, but Rick is absolutely locked in. He also brings up the whole, make sure you have a round in the chamber and your safety off, which becomes a fun little recurring motif that also just makes sense. Most people, and in this case even someone who's apparently trained to be a police officer, don't really know how guns work. So it does work out to be this slightly somber motif because the necessity of using that gun, it's not a good thing, right?
Next time, though, take the safety off.
I know how the safety works.
Again, in the later seasons, they tried making these recurring motifs out of things that just don't make sense. It doesn't really feel like a rewarding callback when it's just like, you remember seeing this random thing in this random location? Well, yeah, now that random thing is in this random location. It's just not that fun. But when you have Rick, for example, reminding Andrea to make sure that the gun is loaded, it becomes this somber reminder because it just makes sense, and it also embodies the message of, I wish I didn't have to remind you. I also love how they portray the shootout itself. It just somehow feels so incredibly raw. There are a bunch of abrupt cuts, and there's definitely a whole lot of shooting, but it doesn't feel over-dramatized, if that makes sense. This is not meant to be an insult at all, and I mean this in the best way possible, but it feels almost low budget, if that makes sense. I think it's also worth noting that, even as the blasting starts, Rick's "Put it down!" still cuts through. I suppose you could interpret this as that peacekeeper side of him. Where everyone else is already locked in and ready to blast, Rick still carries on his police duties and tries to de-escalate. They've already called out a gun, and yes, you can say that Rick is kinda dumb to be right in the front. But it makes perfect sense based on the Rick we know. And the 1, 2, 3 back to back to back is also a great little subversion. You think Rick getting hit once would already be bad, but then another dude crawls out, this time with a shotgun. Also pretty bad. But even after that, a third one pops up and gets Rick yet again. If you really wanted to overanalyze, I suppose you could take it to be mild foreshadowing towards Shane's attempt to backstab him, and the dangers of just leaving your back exposed in general. I do think that's a stretch though. I actually think they just wanted it to be realistic, so Rick gets hit in the bulletproof vest and he's totally fine. But when he gets up and thinks that everything is fine, he gets hit in the back, which, is very, very bad. Fading on over to the hospital, I absolutely love how they depict the passage of time here. We see this surreal POV shot of Shane bringing flowers to Rick. And because we are in Rick's point of view, we then abruptly cut to an overhead shot of Rick lying in the bed and talking as if Shane was right there. Only, he isn't. Just as abruptly, the camera zooms out and we see that the room is empty. All the equipment is turned off and we see a dozen cards left on the cupboard. That could be because his entire police unit sends it, but personally, I sort of interpret it as a long time passing. But I think the greatest shot here is absolutely Rick looking at the flowers and seeing that they've just completely withered away. I think it's the perfect visual symbolism of what has happened to the world and life in general while he's been sleeping here. In the comic, this entire wake-up sequence, much like the rest of the early issues, is incredibly fast. Rick wakes up in shock and that's about it. The story just hits the ground running. The show, on the other hand, again, leaned into that surreal nature of waking up in this totally different world. Rick struggles, he falls, it's awkward and it's clumsy, all to ground us in this seemingly very out there scenario of a zombie apocalypse. This isn't going to be a story about a single chosen dude finding a cure or rising up to be some legend in the apocalypse. No, he is just a dude who got unlucky and then very, very lucky, I guess. This premise and this world, it will be treated 100% seriously. And so, Rick will struggle. He might even act like a bit of a dum-dum because all of this just feels so alien. More on that in a second. And also note just how washed out all the colors are. I think it's another way to put us in Rick's shoes where everything feels weirdly samey and it's almost hard to tell things apart from one another. And I think that too is immediately contrasted by the dark hallways with flickering lights. Suddenly, it's no longer about telling things apart, now it's just seeing anything. It's just constant visual whiplash to add to that inexplicable feeling of waking up in a perfectly clean hospital bed to now this. And that is on full display as Rick notices the completely mangled walker with just that single light flickering atop it. As the colors get colder again, Rick wanders through the even more heavily destroyed corridor, also noticing countless bullet impacts all across the walls and the famous "Don't Dead Open Inside" door. Because it apparently is not obvious, no, you don't need to explain how it's actually don't open dead inside. Relax, everyone knows that, it's a joke. Relax. Don't Dead Open Inside is funny because of the way it is formatted and because of the whole graphic design is my passion memes. The spacing between the text is so small that you can easily read it vertically and then realize that it's wrong. That's what makes it funny. You don't need to explain this. Everyone knows this. Please stop leaving comments on a 3-year-old video about that. Everyone knows this, I promise to you. Anyway, this is another great bit of vignette storytelling taken from a little later in the books. With what is essentially just a single prop, we can infer that there was a massive struggle to contain the virus right here in the hospital. People tried to help each other, to seal away the dead, and to leave a message. But when was that? Who was that?
Hey, Vsauce! Michael here.
Was it at the start, or already days into the outbreak? Was it the military, or just helpless doctors? We see some of that with the Shane flashback later in the season, but there is still a lot that is left to your imagination with the initial horrors that clearly must have gone down in the hospital. Which, by the way, is exactly why we need a series detailing the fall of society a la Early Fear or the World War Z book. The book, not the movie. We then get this incredible sequence of Rick rushing through the doors straight into darkness, with just a single match lighting his way. The match goes out, and then again, and then again. It's subtly building suspense, because why is the match constantly going out if something wasn't going to pop out at him? But nothing ever does. And just as we get used to that match going in and out, comes blinding light. A whole new world opens up, one we cannot even see. Just like Rick, we have total sensory overload. It takes time for us to adjust. The camera never lets us catch a single glimpse of the outside world. That is, until Rick finally makes his way down the stairs and we zoom out. There's this great abrupt cut as Rick sees one, then another, then more, and finally we zoom out to see the entire courtyard littered in body bags. I've always thought that these kind of abrupt cuts to just zoom out and show you the sheer scale of all of this death have been incredibly powerful. In many ways, I think it's actually infinitely more powerful than actually seeing all of that death happen. Extremely mild spoilers for House of the Dragon Season 2 skip to this time, but I think they pulled off that intense juxtaposition extremely well very recently. Especially when the characters involved might not be like the most important, just zooming out and seeing the aftermath of that, in my opinion, is infinitely harsher than actually seeing the fight. In terms of direction, much of the sequence is also a great blend of Kirkman's material and 28 Days Later with Jim's Awakening. Some of these shots are even replicated essentially one for one. I think it's for good reason too. Jim wandering around is up there with some of the most well shot and memorable pieces of apocalyptic media ever. But I think all of these shots here are meant to portray Rick as small, as if death engulfs him and the entire world. And as this unsettling violin/cello, I don't know what it is, creeps into the scene, we get a follow-up sequence to answer that question that might have been lingering in your mind of, well, what remains? Traditionally, you'd expect hospitals, military outposts, and labs to be like the last places standing, right? Well, we already see that the hospital is entirely dead. Now we see an entire military outpost sporting both Humvees and helicopters also entirely dead. And by the end of the season, we'd of course also see the CDC, which too, say it with me now, is dead. The running theme here, and really for most of the early Walking Dead story, is really the death of hope. There is no safe place. There is no cure, no hospitals, no military. It is all gone. No one is coming to save anyone. This is a story about adapting to this new world, because this is the new world.
And when that little girl came out of the barn, I knew you knew it too. There's no hope.
As Rick begins his way home, he sees the now famous bicycle walker named Hannah, which I think too is meant to be this sad but incredibly gruesome reminder of what once was. When the episode originally came out, I interpreted the bike to have actually been hers. And so with this scene, I thought it was sort of Rick borrowing from the dead and later coming to, finish the deal. But in the torn apart webisode, we see her full story, which actually has nothing to do with the bike. The super TLDR version of that, she was a mother who got caught in a car accident at the very, very start of the apocalypse. A bunch of shenanigans happens in between with divorced families and whatnot, but in the end, she gets her kids and heads to the park for the evacuation to Atlanta. While searching a car, she is bit and stays behind while her kids continue to the park. The significance in that being the park, because when Rick eventually comes back to put her down, she's crawling through, presumably, the same park. Even in death, she tried being close to her children. So knowing that, her reached out hand, almost as if to ask Rick for help, definitely hits a whole lot harder. I think it really embodies that sense of, Every person you see on the streets has a life that is just as complex as yours. Sure, they may be zombies in The Walking Dead, but their story is equally, if not more tragic than the ones we are seeing right now. All of them had dreams, they had hopes, they had families, loved ones, but now it's just dead, withered away. Also, I get that bikes don't really look cool for TV, but come on, they're like the most practical form of transportation. Why are there not more of them? I say that, but apparently that might not be true because like the US infrastructure is extremely different from the EU. Like here, everyone uses a bike, it's all great. In the US, apparently you have to drive for like 50 miles, 14 feet, and 13 PlayStations to get to the nearest store, so I guess your infrastructure is just a bit different. But speaking of tragedy, Rick's arrival home is another punch in the guts. We see these scattered boxes as Rick rushes through the house, realizing that it too is completely empty. I love all the abrupt cuts to, again, plant us in the shoes of Rick. It's this hectic confusion where clearly time passes in between, but we never know how much. In a split moment, Rick goes from wailing to questioning reality, to anger, back to crying. We don't know if that was 10 minutes, if that was an hour, if it was 2 hours, we never know, it's just confusion. Though as he walks out to sit on the staircase, he sees this figure stumbling down the streets. I think it's fair to say that most of us assume that it's a walker, but just like him, we can't actually make out who or what it is, or better yet, whether it's just some hallucination. But as Rick wakes up, we immediately see the one and only thing that matters now. Did you get bit? There's a bunch of subtle lore thrown into all of these conversations, most of which seems extremely obvious to us now, but I think it's important to note that back in 2010, and most certainly back in 2003 when the comic was coming out, all of the zombie stuff really wasn't well defined. I think that's why in the early 2000s you saw this explosion of different kinds of infected in different media. There were the original Romero slow zombies, but some had remnants of intelligence, like the Butcher for example. Then there was the Rage virus, which nigh instantly turned people into non-stop death machines. And even more than that, franchises like Left 4 Dead or even Resident Evil turned them into some pseudo-superpower-infused nightmare creatures. So as much as this whole did you get bit thing might seem played out nowadays, I think all of these little conversations with Morgan were incredibly effective in conveying not just the more horror-based approach to the walkers, but also the psychological horror surrounding the turning process. This wouldn't be the Rage virus where the chain of infection is explosive. Here, that death, it'll be slow and it'll be miserable. Once again, without us ever really getting any kind of backstory, you can infer the horror show that the early days of the apocalypse would have looked like. Thousands put into hospitals, all slowly dying as doctors just scramble to understand what's going on. But one by one, completely randomly, they begin to turn. It's nowhere near as crazy as like the volatiles or even just the Rage virus. But what makes it scary is just how insidious it is. Like we just saw with Rick, from a distance, you might mistake a walker for a person, but one wrong turn and you can easily wander into a full-on horde. I think that single line of, you know about the dead people, right? Not the ones they put down, the ones they didn't. The walkers definitely captures like that Walking Dead vibe. We also look back to what I said with the smart walkers with Morgan's wife Jenny. All the POV shots we get here are so cool and really sell that sense of never getting a true look outside. Just like Rick, we are limited in the information we are actually getting. But most importantly, it's that same question of zooming in on that already existing conflict. It's not just a walker of a loved one. It's one that keeps returning to the house and even turning the doorknob, as if asking to be let back inside. And it's that part that makes it so much more unsettling, because what if there is something left inside? It's easy for us to say that, no, there's obviously nothing, she is completely dead and nothing will ever turn her back. But for Morgan, it's obviously nowhere near as simple. Think of how many people in the real world associate completely random outcomes with like a good luck charm or whatever else. Many people will even tell you that they know it's bogus, but they still hold on to it because, what if it isn't? And the same thing goes here. Even knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jenny is totally gone, he still can't accept it. And that doorknob turning? Like, bro, it's so creepy. And in the wider story, I think you can also think of Morgan as another counterweight to Rick. He too is a father, so it's even clearer than with Shane, but the question is one of a protector. He talks about how she too just burned out, saying he couldn't stop the fever, but then saying that he couldn't put her down. At this point in time, that protection part is more so psychological, since, Dwayne isn't exactly happy to see his undead mom again. But in the long run, that is doubly true because it's Morgan's weakness and inability to put Jenny down that causes Dwayne's death. It's his humanity that held him back, but after the death of Dwayne, well, he certainly spirals. As they return to Rick's house, that angle of this being a story about humanity is played up once again, as Rick proclaims that he knows Carl and Lori are alive because the photo albums are gone. It's that desperate attempt to hold on to the memories of a bygone world, ones of no material value, but of immeasurable value to them. And Lenny James here, oh man, the way he goes from this uneasy laughter to just sorrow, but also anger, it is insane.
There I am packing survival gear. She's grabbing photo out.
Dwayne then notes that they're likely in Atlanta. I already yapped about it earlier, but everything in this episode is bonking us over the head that all of it is gone. So yes, while it does give Rick this immediate goal, it will be entirely undermined. Ditto for the CDC. It's an obvious point of interest since, it's a virus. And actually, it's time for another brief tangent, because the mere mention of the CDC is a pretty major departure from the comic. By design, with the exception of Eugene's lie, the book never even raised the possibility of a cure because it was antithetical to the entire point of the story. With the show, on the other hand, as much as it is a major remix and they do arguably play their hand a little bit too early, I still think it demonstrates an incredible understanding of the story that they are telling. It does introduce the CDC because it only makes sense to mention, but it becomes not just false hope, but also the place where Rick learns that it's not even just the bites that turn them, everyone is already infected. So if the book's goal was to never even explore a cure, then the show essentially said, yeah, I know you're wondering about that, but you know what? You and your cure. Just like with the smart walkers and everything else, I think it is simply there to actually strengthen the comics' message and not undermine it. Another great sequence exploring those different forms of coping with this new world is the trio heading on over to the police station. The scene of them discovering that they still have hot water and then just showering is just fluff. But I also think it is incredibly important because it's this one tiny victory that works as a strong bonding moment for Rick and Morgan. Plot-wise, of course it's not important. Rick could have just said, oh, I owe you my life, here, take some guns, I don't know. But this is not a plot-driven show, it is a character one. So seeing these tiny victories just breathes that humanity into this undead world. Ditto for Morgan reflecting on the start of the outbreak, saying that they too were headed for Atlanta, but after Jenny, they just froze. We'd later also kinda sorta explore this with Herschel, but chances are, many people had this fear-induced paralysis once the outbreak started. And for many, that likely caused their deaths. But at the same time, judging by everything we saw of the evacuations, that wasn't a surefire way to survive either. So it's hard to say whether Morgan staying back was a blessing or a curse. Story-wise though, it again just sketches in a little bit more of that uncertainty and chaos at the start of the outbreak. But I think the most important detail here is Rick giving the radio to Morgan, saying that he'd turn it on for a few minutes every day at dawn. Normally, you'd expect it to be a Chekhov's gun of sorts, right? I mean, even by the end of this episode, contacting someone on the walkie-talkie sure would come in handy now, wouldn't it? But it's not really a Chekhov's gun. Rick never gets in contact with Morgan until they literally just go back to Kings County. So more than anything, I think it's meant to convey how even these lifelines were severed. In the apocalypse, sure you can make promises, but keeping them is a whole different story. Like we saw with the don't open dead inside doors, there has been a total breakdown of communication. What was once an ally quickly becomes a pseudo-villain the next time we see him. For Rick, those little calls might have just been him sending a message into the ether. But for Morgan, it was a desperate hope of someone, anyone hearing him, but Rick never did. And yet another excellent scene here is Leon stumbling up to the fence, that being the newbie who Rick reminded to check for his safety. I think you can look at it as sort of another personification of the old world and even Rick's duties as an officer now being dead. He might have thought that he was careless, but he obviously knew Leon, so seeing a fellow officer like that, it must hurt. It goes back to what we talked about with the bicycle walker. Before we get to all the hype zombie story fun times, we first explore what it actually means to put down walkers. The concept of a zombie does not exist in this universe, so taking that first step of just accepting them as monsters is no small feat. Also, bonus fact, if in the TV show the word zombie is never even muttered, in the comic book there are actually a few mentions of the prohibited Z word. Zombies don't exist in either universe though. And to explore that even further, we then see Morgan flipping through the picture books of Jenny. Something that, of course, ties directly into that whole conversation of what was important. Survival gear or just albums. In spite of what he might have said, those albums, they clearly turned out to be incredibly important to him. Morgan just can't sever that connection to their old life. Even putting Jenny in his sights, he just can't pull the trigger. Which in my mind is like the perfect encapsulation of The Walking Dead is a story about people, not the zombies. It's about the unimaginable mental and psychological toll this world takes on the people living through it. I talked about it earlier already, but this is of course also mirrored on Rick's side with his return to Hannah.
I'm sorry this happened to you.
Once again, perfect, I have nothing else to add. Except that this shot is also gorgeous. We then cut to Rick broadcasting on the radio, repeating his message about approaching Atlanta over and over, only to be met with silence. That is, until we smash cut to a survivor camp with Amy picking up. She can get through to Rick, which is sad and all, but right away we also catch a glimpse of Lori, Carl, and then even Shane makes a extremely sharp entrance. Get it, sharp entrance because of the Axel, shut up. I always loved how informational asymmetry is leveraged here. Through Rick, we just learned that Atlanta was supposed to have a safe zone and whatever else. But here, we have Lori saying that they should warn people to stay out of the city. The reveal that we would have had with Rick is deliberately undermined for the sake of creating a sense of foreboding rather than just explicit shock. In many ways, the show itself just spoiled the big reveal that Atlanta is indeed dead. Also note Carl repping a Science Dog t-shirt. And to continue on that thread of Rick and Shane we saw at the start of this episode, Shane is immediately taking the role of a protector and saying that no one is going anywhere. This isn't Rick or Morgan offering each other a helping hand. He is already presented as caring about their group and their group alone. And to be fair, that does make perfect sense. Going into the city is a bad idea, but then again, that is also a little odd coming from a police officer. Rick was showing mercy to a walker, but Shane doesn't even entertain the idea of somehow trying to make sure they don't head into the city. For him, it's not even about going into the city because sure, that's a bad idea. It's about not even trying to communicate. But that's all small fries compared to what comes next. And yes, I did say fries specifically because of the scene we saw at the start, because when he goes to talk to Lori, he gets closer and closer and closer, and suddenly they are way too close. So dipping those fries into Rick's ketchup, yeah, Shane is not a cool dude. And to make that even more tragic, we smash cut to Rick looking at the photo of their family. Rick is out here, borderline coming back from the dead with one singular goal, to find his family. Like with any family, they might have disagreements and their own differences, but when push came to shove, they mean everything to him. Shane, and Lori of course too on the other hand, be it due to the unimaginable stress they've been put under, or maybe just because their personalities lined up, don't forget that she was the one turning off the lights after all. They have already gotten awfully close. In just a couple of episodes, we'd of course see Rick arrive and almost immediately say that they need to go back into Atlanta. Something we just saw Shane shut down in an instant. So, as messed up as it is, Shane will quickly convince himself that Lori suddenly needs protection from Rick. That aside though, there's also contrasting with the pictures themselves. With Rick, we see how they are the thing that just push him forward, they keep him going. For Morgan, on the other hand, they are this inescapable burden, this constant, heavy, painful reminder that he just cannot give up. But we then get to one of my personal favorite sequences in this pilot, Rick coming across this lone house. We only catch a brief glimpse inside with the "God forgive us" writing on the wall. Like with so many different things in this episode, it provides us with another perspective of how people dealt with the collapse of society. People like Morgan hold on to those sentimental values. He stays in his hometown, desperately trying to cling on to the memories of Jenny. There are people like Shane who have already grown a lot more cold with who gets his help and who he will protect. He might have been a police officer, but as we see in his flashback, he saw terrible, terrible things. At this point, he's not indebted to anyone. The only thing that matters is his circle. There are people like Rick who are still grappling with the empathy of the old world and the cruelty that lies in front of him. But then, there are people like this. Ones who simply didn't want to deal with any of it and chose their own way out. But in that same breath, we also see Rick finding a horse right next to that spine-chilling sight. Suddenly, there's this paradoxical beauty of nature reclaiming the world. Life itself now becomes the most beautiful thing. The colors are suddenly super vibrant as Rick just chats to the horse, this calm, ambient music fading into the background.
Other horses too, I bet.
In the comic, this is also where Rick gets his incredibly signature hatchet that was unfortunately removed for most of the TV show. But hey, at least we got the revolver, right? But now riding upon the horse, Rick enters Atlanta, giving us what is easily one of the most memorable posters in all of fiction. And I also love that bit of vignette storytelling here again, where one side of the street is completely piled up, while the other is entirely empty. It's such a chilling sight. Just imagining the panic where, on one hand, you're being told to remain in the containment areas, but everyone is just trying to get out of the city. This is exactly why we need a series detailing everything about the collapse of the quarantine zones, etc., etc. Basically, take the containment miniseries and do it with The Walking Dead. As he walks through the city, we basically see the repeats of what we already saw with the hospital. Humvees, military helicopters, all the weaponry and technology in the world, but absolutely nothing to show for it. A few walkers crawl out of the buses and whatnots, but Rick just mumbles that they can handle a few. But then, there are the crows. A already established bad omen that seemingly is contrasted by a helicopter buzzing overhead. Suddenly, there's a spark of hope, right? We've seen so many disabled choppers already. This is one that must be going to some kind of safe zone, right? But this is The Walking Dead and we just saw those crows. So that hope leads Rick right into the thick of the Atlanta horde. The comic kept hordes under wraps for a very, very long time. For context, the first horde we saw in the book was season 4 to 5-ish story. But I think the immediate showcase of what even these slow and dumb zombies are capable of was kind of a must in the premiere. Just like Morgan said, 1 or 2, it's no big deal. I think all of us thought that while watching The Walking Dead. But when there are this many and they become just a combined mass, not fun. And I'm gonna be honest with you, when I first watched The Walking Dead, I did think that this whole infection is a bit of a stretch, but after we've now lived through the Great Plague just a couple years ago, not gonna lie, I think The Walking Dead more than realistic enough. Rick gets knocked off of the horse and crawls under the tank. That quickly, that one hope of life, his new buddy Horsey, is torn to shreds as he himself is forced to the ground. He fires off 5 rounds and then stops. He saves one last bullet. He apologizes to Carl and Lori and raises the barrel up to his head. This tiny scene here is so powerful, even if it only lasts for, a moment. He immediately crawls into the tank. This entire tank escapade is another totally new add-in for the show. But that moment of Rick consciously saving onto the last bullet is just, oh man. The Road actually explores this quite chilling idea of always holding onto that quick way out, if you will. Massive recommend if you haven't read it or seen the movie. It too is a story about a father and a son, so it definitely fits that broken father type of vibe a la Rick and Joel. But living in a world where you need to hold on to one bullet in case things get, real bad, it does sort of beg the question of, is it even worth living in this world, that kind of vibe. It's very, very dark, it's very morbid, and I love it. But as soon as he gets into the tank, he is met with another problem in the form of another walker. He fires off the final bullet he had in the revolver, his ears ringing like there's no tomorrow. First off, I wish they took hearing damage more seriously in the show, and I don't say that just because MatPat made a video on it. I say that because I think scenes like this add even more grit to what is already an unforgiving story. I think if we were to see characters do small things of just trying to block their ears in enclosed spaces and stuff, it would have added even more of that uncomfortable realism to a lot of these scenes. But numero 2, and this is definitely overanalyzing, I think you can also interpret him firing off the final round and losing that easy way out as a sort of a symbol that he will have to fight. Also, this dude in the tank, not just a random dude. Season 2 was actually originally meant to tell the story of this tank, this dude, and the downfall of Atlanta. More on that in the Walking Dead retrospective. I also absolutely love this shot of Rick just shrouded in darkness. The soldier in the background and the military as a whole is dead. The tank is dead. He is surrounded by the dead. Even his trusty revolver is empty. All there is survival. He holds on to this different gun, pressing it against his head as if praying to it. But right in the midst of that despair comes another spark of hope.
Yeah, you in the tank. You cozy in there?
This scene too is an add-in for the show, and I'll go out on a limb and say that it alone probably made Glenn a fan favorite for many people. Just how goofy and just fun that scene is works so well in contrast with everything else. For some reason, you don't really see a lot of these characters who fall right in between that line of a hardened survivor like Rick, and the more out there personalities and ones that maybe are not as strong, but they do have like very specific skills. Glenn is incredibly capable, in some ways even more so than Rick, but he's also nowhere near as willing to do the things that Rick wouldn't even flinch at. And also his one-liners are gold.
Delivered pizzas? Why?
And as Space Junk plays us out, we zoom out to see the endless horde swarming Atlanta, one that Rick will somehow have to traverse. And yes, all of that is just episode 1. I don't think The Walking Dead is particularly unique in having an extremely strong pilot. Most series pour a ton of effort into hooking viewers with the first episode. But personally, I don't think it's just strong. I think it's damn near perfect. I would easily put it up there alongside the pilots of Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, Attack on Titan, The Last of Us, more recently Frieren, and even my own personal pick that I will defend against the end of time, SAO. No, I'm not joking, the first episode has one of the greatest hooks in all of fiction. Especially looking at it as an adaptation of already existing material, and the more time passes, the more true I think it becomes. It's insane to me how well it understands the content it's drawing on and enriches it. I myself have gone on a bit of a journey when it comes to Darabont's special walkers, but the more I think about them, the more I realize that my initial apprehension to their inclusion was kinda just whiplash and kind of emotional. Surely, there can be no smart walkers in my Walking Dead, right? But like I've been yapping on for a good 40 minutes now, they're not actually smart, and they never draw the main focus from the human story that is The Walking Dead. So even for a classic Walking Dead purist like me, I can't deny the fact that the way they're leveraged, it's nothing short of genius. I wouldn't go as far as to say that Darabont's vision for Season 2 would have made the story like infinitely better as many others have said, but then again, I don't want to write blank checks either. Who knows? Maybe it would have been better, maybe it wouldn't have. But the main message I want to get across here is that no matter how disconnected I am from the AMC franchise nowadays, the premiere, it instantly brings me back. I know The Walking Dead is like that one show that everyone used to watch and everyone used to talk about, but now when you hear about it, it's like, wait, they're still making it? It's like not the main show, of course, but it's still pretty funny because, you know, they're still using the main title. But yeah, you know what? Give the premiere another look. Maybe you'll find yourself halfway through Season 3 like I most certainly did not while writing this script. Yeah, sorry about that. Happy spooky season. And that's the video. Many of you have asked me, why is the series I do on The Walking Dead called a brief retrospective? Well, I hope this showed you why. That version? Yeah, that's a brief one. Attack on Titan is getting an actual retrospective series where like each video covering a 20-minute episode is like 45 minutes long. That's what an actual retrospective looks like in my book. All that being said, all of my links and the merch store is in the description, and with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest members of the team, Philip Trajkovsky, I think I'm sorry if I butchered the name, Teresa's Green, and Fat Lucky Potato. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.